The golden sun of Kepler 442 was setting over the hills of New Eden, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded the colonists of Earth sunsets they had only seen in photographs. And Commander Elena Vasquez stood on her balcony, watching the children play in the fields below New Eden was humanity's pride. A frontier colony of 12,000 souls who had traveled across the stars to build a new home. And among them were 2,000 children who filled the settlement with laughter and hope and endless energy. That made even the hardest days worthwhile. Elena smiled as she watched a group of kids chasing each other through the tall golden wheat, their voices carrying on the warm evening breeze. And she thought about how far humanity had come since those first tentative steps into space. The Harvest Festival would begin tomorrow, and the whole colony was buzzing with excitement, decorating the town square with lights and banners, while the smell of baking bread and cooking meat drifted from every kitchen. She had no idea that everything was about to change forever. Far above the peaceful colony, hidden behind the planet's largest moon, a fleet of ships waited in the darkness, their hulls black as the void itself, and aboard the command vessel, High Commander Zixter of the Valkyrie. The minions studied the human settlement with cold, compound eyes. The Valkyrie were insectoids, beings of pure logic and calculation who had conquered dozens of worlds across the galaxy, and they viewed emotions as weakness, as a flaw that made species like humans unworthy of the resources they possessed. The humans celebrate. Zixter clicked to his subordinate, his mandibles twitching with what might have been contempt. They waste time on festivities while we prepare to teach them their place in the galaxy. Shall we strike during their celebration, High Commander? The subordinate asked. No, we strike after, when they are tired and content and their guard is at its lowest. And we will take specimens from their young ones to study their weaknesses. The Valkyrie had observed humanity for years, watching them spread across the stars with their loud voices and their strange attachments to one another. And the High Cluster back on the homeworld had decided it was time to test these creatures. Other species in the Galactic Council spoke of humans with a strange caution that the Valkyrie did not understand, warning that there was something about them that should not be provoked. But the Valkyrie dismissed such talk as superstition. What could these soft, emotional beings possibly do against the might of the Dominion? The Harvest Festival came and went in a blur of joy and celebration, with music playing until late into the night and children staying up past their bedtimes to dance under the stars. And when morning came, the colony of New Eden settled into peaceful sleep. Elena was in her office reviewing supply reports when the first explosion shook the building. She grabbed her unit and ran outside. And what she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Valkyrie dropships were descending from the sky like a swarm of metal locusts, their weapons firing into the colony without warning or mercy. All security teams to defensive positions. She screamed into the but she already knew they were outmatched, outnumbered, and unprepared for an assault of this magnitude. The Valkyrie soldiers moved through the streets with terrifying efficiency, their exoskeletons deflecting the colonists' desperate gunfire as they pushed toward the center of town. And Elena realized with horror exactly where they were heading, the school complex. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning and her heart pounding. But by the time she reached the school, the Valkyrie were already there, dragging screaming children from the buildings, while their parents fought and died trying to stop them. Lena watched a mother throw herself at a Valkyrie soldier, clawing at its armored hide, and the alien simply swatted her aside like an insect, her body crumpling against a wall as her child was carried away. No. Elena raised her weapon and fired again and again, but the Valkyrie barely noticed, their mission too important to be delayed by one human's resistance. The attack lasted 47 minutes, though to the survivors it felt like an eternity. And when the Valkyrie finally retreated to their ships, they left behind a colony in ruins and hearts shattered beyond repair. 37. Children lay dead in the streets and schoolyard, their small bodies broken by alien weapons that had no business being used against innocents. And 200 more had been taken, dragged onto those black ships and carried off into the void. Elena knelt in the ashes of what had been the kindergarten building, and in her arms she held a dying boy no older than 6. His breaths coming in shallow gasps as blood soaked through her uniform. "It hurts," the boy whispered, his eyes looking up at her with confusion and fear. "Where's my mommy?" "She's coming, sweetheart," Elena lied. "Because his mother was among the dead. She's coming. And everything is going to be okay." The boy smiled at that. Just a little, and then he was gone, his small body going still in her arms as the last breath left his lungs. Elena held him for a long time, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face, and around her the survivors gathered, their wails of grief rising into the smoke-filled sky. But beneath her grief, something else was growing, something cold and hard and patient. And when she finally laid the boy down and stood up, her eyes had changed. "Record a message," she said to her aide, her voice steady despite everything. "Send it to Earth, to Mars, to every human colony and station in explored space." "Commander, what should I say?" Elena looked at the burning school, at the small bodies being laid in rows by weeping parents, at the empty spaces where 200 children should have been playing. "Tell them what happened here today," she said. "Tell them the Valkyrie took our children. And tell them we are coming to take them back." The message went out across the stars, carried by quantum entanglement relays at speeds faster than light. And within hours, every human in the galaxy knew what the Valkyrie had done to the children of New Eden on Earth. The President of the United Nations watched the footage with tears in his eyes before calling an emergency session of the Global Council on Mars. Factory workers stopped their shifts to gather around screens, and then quietly returned to their stations with new purpose burning in their hearts on 100 colony worlds. Soldiers who had thought their fighting days were over began checking their weapons and their armor and in the halls of the Galactic Council. The other species watched humanity's reaction with growing unease, remembering all those warnings they had dismissed as exaggeration. The Valkyrie had made a terrible mistake, and the galaxy was about to learn what happened when you harmed human children. Elena stood among the ruins of New Eden and made a promise to the dead and the taken. A promise that carried on the wind and echoed in the hearts of billions across the stars. "We will find them," she whispered. "Every single one of them. And anyone who stands in our way will learn why the galaxy should have left our children alone." The stars had never seemed so cold. But in the darkness, a fire was being kindled that would burn brighter than any sun. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was the largest artificial structure in known space, a massive dome floating in the void between. Stars where representatives of 1,000 species gathered to debate and negotiate and occasionally accomplish something useful. Ambassador David Chun had served humanity in this hall for 15 years, navigating the complex web of alien politics with patience and skill. But today he walked to his podium with a heaviness in his step that made the other delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Thalvari ambassador, an ancient being of crystalline structure who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, leaned toward his aide and whispered, "Watch the human carefully. Something is different about him today." High Representative Zixter of the Valkyrie stood at the center podium, his compound eyes gleaming with what might have been satisfaction as he addressed the assembly. "The Dominion acknowledges that a minor incident occurred at the human colony designated New Eden," he clicked, his translator rendering his words in the cold tones the Valkyrie preferred. This was merely a territorial correction, a reminder to the humans that they have expanded beyond their rightful boundaries. Murmurs rippled through the hall, and dozens of alien eyes turned toward the human delegation. Waiting to see how they would respond to this insult, Ambassador Chun stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, and the hall fell silent. 47 children are dead, he said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber without a hint of the emotion that must have been churning beneath. 200 more have been taken from their families and are being held in Valkyrie facilities for what you call study. Unfortunate casualties of necessary action, Zixter replied dismissively. The Dominion warns humanity against any retaliation, as such actions would be met with overwhelming force. Chun said nothing for a long moment, and that silence seemed to stretch across the hall like a physical weight then. Without a word, he reached up and removed his diplomatic credentials, the silver badge that marked him as humanity's voice in this assembly, and he placed it carefully on his podium. Ambassador Chun, the council speaker, interjected nervously. What is the meaning of this? Chun looked at the Valkyrie representative one last time, his eyes holding something that made even the emotionless insectoid shift uneasily. And then he simply turned and walked out of the hall. No threats, no demands, no negotiations, just silence. The Thovari ambassador watched him go with something that might have been fear, and he turned to his aide with urgency in his crystalline voice. Contact our homeworld immediately, he said. Tell them the humans have stopped talking. And in 400 years of observing them, I have never seen humans stop talking across human space. Something unprecedented was happening on Earth. The governments of nations that had been rivals for centuries were meeting in emergency sessions. And what emerged from those meetings was not the usual bickering and compromise, but unified purpose. The president of the European Federation stood beside the premier of the Asian coalition, both announcing that all territorial disputes were suspended indefinitely. All resources redirected to a single goal, our children, the president said simply. Nothing else matters until they come home. Corporations that had spent decades fighting over markets and patents suddenly opened their research vaults, sharing technologies they had guarded jealously. Because profit meant nothing when the images of New Eden played on every screen. A weapons manufacturer in Germany shared shield technology with a rival in Brazil. And within days they had combined their expertise into something neither could have built alone, a shipyard in orbit around Jupiter that had been building luxury liners, scrapped its current projects and began converting to military production. Its workers volunteering for double shifts without asking for extra pay. Veterans who had hung up their uniforms years ago began appearing at recruitment centers. Gray-haired men and women who still remembered how to fight and wanted to teach a new generation, and in secret facilities hidden across human space, scientists began working on projects that had been deemed too dangerous, too extreme, too terrible ever to be used. The galaxy thought it knew humanity's military strength, but humanity had been hiding things, keeping secrets, preparing for a day they hoped would never come. That day had come. Meanwhile, on a Valkyrie research station in a distant corner of the Dominion, the stolen children of New Eden huddled together in cold. Metal Cell's 9-year-old May Santos had been the oldest child in her class, and now she found herself responsible for dozens of younger ones who looked to her with frightened eyes. I want my mommy, a small boy whimpered, and May pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him, even though she was just as scared. I know, she whispered. I know, but we have to be brave, okay? We have to stick together and take care of each other until our people come for us. Will they come? Another child asked, her voice trembling. May thought about her father, a quiet man who worked in the colony's agricultural center, and her mother, who taught history at the school that was now probably ashes and rubble. Yes, she said with a certainty she forced herself to feel. They will come for us. All of them will come. Because that is what humans do. The Valkyrie scientists observed the children through cameras, taking notes on their behavior with clinical detachment. Fascinating. One of them clicked to another. Even the young ones exhibit strong social bonding. They comfort each other despite their own distress. A weakness, the other replied. This attachment they feel makes them vulnerable, easier to control through manipulation of their connections. They did not understand what they were seeing, could not comprehend that this was not weakness, but humanity's greatest strength. The thing that had carried them across the stars and would now carry them to war back on Earth. Admiral James Okonkwo stood before the largest gathering of human military leadership in history. A room full of officers from every nation and colony who had put aside their differences for this moment. The children of New Eden are waiting for us, he said, his deep voice steady and sure. And we will not make them wait long. He pulled up a holographic display showing the known positions of Valkyrie forces, their supply lines, their communication networks. We will not simply rescue our children, he continued. We will make certain that no species ever thinks about harming human young again. And we will do this not through threats or negotiations, but through actions that will echo through galactic history. An officer raised her hand. Admiral, the Galactic Council has warned us against military action. They say we risk becoming pariahs. Okonkwo smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression. The Council had their chance to act, to enforce laws against the targeting of children. And they did nothing, so now we will do what must be done. And history will judge whether we were right. He looked out at the assembled officers, seeing the same cold determination in every face. In 6 months, we launch Operation Homecoming, and when it is done, the galaxy will understand that there is no distance far enough, no army strong enough, no force in the universe powerful enough to protect those who harm our children. The officers stood and saluted. And across human space, ships were being built. Soldiers were being trained, and a fury unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen was being forged into the sharpest weapon imaginable. The Valkyrie continued their experiments, confident in their superiority, unaware that their time was running out. And in her cell, May Santis taught the younger children songs from Earth, keeping their spirits alive with stories of heroes and happy endings, never doubting that rescue would come. My dad told me once, she said to the children gathered around her, that humans never give up on family, never ever. And we are all family now. The stars turned in their ancient dance. 6 months passed like a held breath, and somewhere in the darkness, a fleet was gathering that would change the galaxy forever. The Valkyrie communication network was considered one of the most advanced in the galaxy. A web of relay stations and quantum links that connected every corner of their vast dominion. And at exactly 040 hours Galactic Standard Time, it all went dark. 200 human Black Ops teams struck simultaneously across Valkyrie space. Teams that had been inserted weeks earlier using stealth technology the galaxy did not know humanity possessed. And in 47 minutes, they severed every major communication line. The Dominion relied upon High Commander Zixter was in his quarters when the alarms began. And by the time he reached the command center, reports were flooding in from panicked subordinates across a dozen systems. High Commander, we have lost contact with Sector 7. Sector 12 is not responding. Our intelligence outposts have gone silent, all of them. Every single one. Zixter's compound eyes scanned the tactical displays, watching as icons representing Valkyrie installations flickered and disappeared one by one. And for the first time in his long life, he felt something that might have been fear. The humans, he clicked. This is the humans, impossible, his aide protested. They do not have the capability for coordinated strikes of this magnitude. Our intelligence confirmed their military is decades behind ours. But even as he spoke, the main display lit up with new contacts, hundreds of them, emerging from faster-than-light travel in perfect, formation around the research station where the human children were being held. Admiral James Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the HSS Lullaby, the dreadnought that served as the flagship of the combined human fleet. And he watched the Valkyrie station grow larger on the view screen. "All ships report ready," Admiral, his executive officer, announced. "The Valkyrie station is attempting to raise shields, but our jamming is preventing their systems from initializing properly." Okonkwo nodded, his face carved from stone. "Open a channel to the station." The communication officer worked her console. "Channel opened, sir. Valkyrie station," Okonkwo said, his voice carrying across the void. "This is Admiral James Okonkwo of the Human Expeditionary Fleet. You have exactly 5 minutes to surrender our children unharmed, or we will come in and take them ourselves." The response came quickly, the station commander's voice filled with false bravado. "Human vessel, you are in violation of Dominion space. Withdraw immediately or face destruction." Okonkwo cut the channel and turned to his tactical officer. "Launch the assault shuttles." The Valkyrie had never seen anything like what came next. Human assault shuttles poured from the fleet's hangars, each one carrying a squad of Marines equipped with weapons and armor that represented humanity's most closely guarded secrets. Technology developed in hidden facilities for exactly this kind of moment. The station's defenders tried to respond, but their weapons seemed to pass harmlessly through the human shields, while return fire punched through Valkyrie armor like it was paper. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was the first through the breach, her powered armor crashing through the station's hull with a squad of Marines behind her. And the moment her boots touched Valkyrie metal, she was moving. "Alpha Team, secure the command center. Bravo Team, find the children." The Valkyrie soldiers that met them in the corridors were elite guards, the best the Dominion had to offer. But they had never fought humans who had nothing to lose. Rodriguez watched the Valkyrie raise its weapon, and she was on it before it could fire, her armored fist crushing its exoskeleton with a single blow. And then she was past it, moving deeper into the station. Contact left. One of her Marines called out, and the squad responded instantly, their training taking over as they cleared room after room with brutal efficiency in the research section. The Valkyrie scientists scrambled to destroy their data, and some of them looked at the children in their cells and considered using them as hostages. They never got the chance. The door to the research wing exploded inward, and Private First Class Thomas Young came through with his rifle up, his helmet sensors immediately identifying the alien researchers as threats. "Step away from the children," he said, his voice amplified by his suit's speakers. "Step away now." One scientist moved toward a young boy, perhaps thinking to grab him as a shield, and Young put a round through its head before it could take a second step. "Anyone else want to try something?" he asked. The remaining Valkyrie did not. The cells were opened one by one, and children who had been held for 6 months finally saw human faces again, heard human voices telling them they were safe in cell block 7. May Santos heard the explosions and the gunfire, and she gathered the younger children behind her, ready to protect them with nothing but her own small body if necessary. When the door to her cell opened and a Marine stepped through, she almost collapsed with relief. The Marine, a woman named Sergeant Chen, who had volunteered for this mission because her own niece had been among the taken, saw May standing there with dozens of terrified children hiding behind her. This 9-year-old girl who had kept them together through 6 months of captivity. Chen knelt down and removed her helmet, showing May a face streaked with tears. "We're here, sweetheart," she said, her voice breaking. "Every single one of us came for you." May stared at her for a long moment, and then the strength that had kept her going for so long finally gave way, and she threw herself into Chen's arms, sobbing. "I knew you would come," she cried. I told them every day that you would come, and we did." Chan whispered. Holding her tight, "We will always come," across the station. Similar scenes played out as Marines reached the children. These hardened soldiers who had trained for war finding themselves weeping as they carried small bodies to safety. 193 children were rescued that day, pulled from cells and labs and holding areas by soldiers who would have died 1,000 times over to save them. But 7 cells were empty, except for small mounds, covered by blankets. Children who had not survived the Valkyrius experiments. And the Marines who found them stood in silence for a long moment, before carefully collecting the remains. Every child would come home. One way or another, the station commander was dragged before Admiral Okonkwo in chains, his compound eyes wide with disbelief at how quickly his impregnable fortress had fallen. "This is an act of war," the commander clicked. "The Dominion will respond with overwhelming force." Okonkwo looked at him with eyes that held no mercy. No compromise, nothing but cold purpose. "You took our children," he said simply. "You killed 7 of them. 7 children who will never grow up, never fall in love, never have children of their own." He held up a data pad showing 7 names, 7 faces, 7 small lives cut short. "We are sending a message to your Dominion," Okonkwo continued. "A message that contains these names and a single sentence." "What message?" the commander asked. Something in his voice that might have been fear. Okonkwo's expression never changed. "You should not have touched them." The message was broadcast across every Valkyrie frequency, on every channel, to every corner of the Dominion. And with it came the names and faces of the 7 children who had died. And then, like a storm that had been building since the day New Eden burned, the full fury of humanity descended upon the Valkyrie Dominion ships that had been gathering in secret emerged from hiding places throughout human space. More ships than anyone had believed humanity could build, crewed by men and women who had volunteered in numbers that overwhelmed the recruitment centers. The rescue had been surgical and precise. But what came next would be something else entirely on the HSS Lullaby. As the rescued children were being transferred to medical ships for the journey home, May Santos found Admiral Okonkwo and tugged on his sleeve. "Sir?" she said, looking up at him with eyes that had seen too much for her age. Okonkwo knelt down to meet her gaze. "Yes, young one?" "There were others," May said. "Other species children that the Valkyrie took. I saw them in other parts of the station. They were scared too." The Admiral's expression softened for just a moment before hardening again with new resolve. "Show us where," he said. "We will save them all." And they did. When the fleet finally departed the ruined station, they carried not just human children, but young of a dozen species that the Valkyrie had taken for their experiments. Children whose own people had been too weak or too afraid to rescue them. The message humanity sent that day was clear. They would protect not just their own young, but any child that needed protecting, and any who threatened the innocent would face consequences beyond imagining. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session for the 3rd time in a week. The representatives of 1,000 species gathering to discuss what they were calling the human crisis, though many whispered that it should more accurately be called the Valkyrie extinction. This cannot be allowed to continue. The Valkyrie ambassador shrieked, his compound eyes wild with panic. "The humans are destroying our infrastructure, our fleets, our very civilization. The council must intervene." Ambassador David Chun had returned to the chamber, though he still refused to wear his diplomatic credentials. And he stood at the human podium with an expression of perfect calm. "The council had its chance to intervene," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "When the Valkyrie slaughtered children, when they abducted the innocent for experiments, the council offered us condolences and called it a minor incident." He looked around at the gathered aliens, many of whom could not meet his gaze. "You had centuries to build laws protecting children. to create consequences for those who would harm the young of any species. And you did nothing. And so now you will destroy an entire civilization? The council speaker demanded. Chun's expression did not change. We will do what must be done to ensure this never happens again. He turned and walked out of the chamber for the second time. And this time, no one tried to stop him. What followed became known in galactic history as the Long Night of the Valkyrie. Though humans simply called it justice, the human fleets did not strike at Valkyrie population centers or civilian targets. That was not the human way, despite what their enemies might believe. And instead, they systematically dismantled Dominion's ability to wage warship yards that had built warships for centuries were reduced to debris fields in a matter of hours. Their defenses overwhelmed by human weapons that seemed almost magical in their destructive efficiency fuel. Depots were seized and their contents redirected to power refugee ships for the dozens of species the Valkyrie had conquered over the millennia. Species who watched in amazement as humans liberated their worlds and asked nothing in return. Military academies, command centers, weapons factories, one by one. The pillars of Valkyrie power crumbled under the relentless human advance, but it was the psychological warfare that truly broke the Dominion's will in every Valkyrie frequency. At every hour of every day, the names and faces of the 7 murdered children were broadcast without pause in the morning. Citizens woke to the image of Marcus Chun, age 4, who had loved building blocks and dreamed of being an engineer. During their work hours, they saw Sarah Williams, age 7, who had been learning to play the violin and wanted to perform for the colony one day at night. As they tried to sleep, they heard the name of James Nakamura, age 5, who had followed his father everywhere and wanted to be just like him when he grew up. 7 children. 7 names, repeated endlessly until every Valkyrie in the Dominion knew them by heart. And with each broadcast came a simple question. Was it worth it? The Valkyrie military tried to rally, assembling their remaining fleets for a decisive battle. But the humans did not fight the way the Valkyrie expected. Human ships appeared where they should not have been possible, striking from angles that defied conventional tactics. And when Valkyrie commanders thought they had gained an advantage, they found themselves surrounded by reinforcements that seemed to materialize from empty space. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Lullaby as his fleet engaged the largest Valkyrie armada ever assembled. And he watched with cold satisfaction as ship after ship fell to human weapons. They're requesting a ceasefire. His communications officer reported, denied. Okonkwo said without hesitation, "We will not negotiate with those who harm children." The battle lasted 6 hours. And when it was over, the Valkyrie Navy existed only in history books on the Valkyrie homeworld. Panic was spreading through the population as news of each defeat reached them. And the High Cluster met in emergency session to debate surrender. The humans will destroy us all. One council member clicked frantically. We must offer whatever terms they demand. They have made no demands, another replied. They do not negotiate. They do not threaten. They simply act. Then what do they want? No one had an answer. The answer came 3 days later. When the sky above the Valkyrie capital filled with human ships, the population waited for orbital bombardment, for the annihilation they believed they deserved. But instead, something far more terrifying happened. The humans landed. Millions of soldiers descended from the sky, not to destroy, but to occupy. And within hours, the capital was under human control, without a single civilian casualty. Members of the High Cluster were arrested and transported to a human vessel, where they were informed that they would stand trial for crimes against children, not just human children, but children of every species the Valkyrie had harmed in their long history of conquest. The trial was broadcast across the galaxy, and for the first time, the universe saw the full scope of Valkyrie cruelty laid bare. Witnesses testified about experiments conducted on the young of conquered species, about children taken from their families and never returned, about atrocities that had been committed for centuries while the trio spoke about. Galactic Council looked the other way. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was something no one expected. You will not be executed, the human judge announced, looking at the assembled Valkyrie leaders with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been pity. Death would be too easy, too final. Instead, the Valkyrie will cease to exist as a sovereign power. Your worlds will become protectorates under human administration. Your military will be disbanded. And your species will be given a chance to learn what you should have learned long ago. The High Cluster members clicked in confusion. Learn what? The judge's expression softened just slightly. How to value the young. How to protect the innocent. How to be part of a galaxy that does not tolerate the harming of children. Human administrators were deployed to every Valkyrie world. And what they built was not the apparatus of occupation, but something entirely different. Schools were established where Valkyrie young were taught alongside human children and the children of other species, where they learned not just facts and figures, but empathy and compassion and the value of every life. Orphanages were created for the young of species the Valkyrie had nearly wiped out, staffed by human volunteers who had come not to conquer but to heal. Medical facilities were open to treat the survivors of Valkyrie experiments, both physical and psychological wounds that would take generations to fully heal. The galaxy watched in amazement as humanity transformed from avengers into caretakers, as the same species that had destroyed the Valkyrie war machine now worked to rebuild what the Valkyrie had broken. I do not understand, the Thelvari ambassador said to his human counterpart at a council session months later. You had the power to destroy them utterly, to erase them from existence, yet you chose to spare them. Why? The human ambassador, a woman named Sarah Chun, who had lost her nephew in the New Eden attack, considered the question carefully. Because destruction was never our goal, she said finally. Our goal was to ensure that no child would ever suffer what those children suffered. And you cannot build a safe future by simply eliminating those who threaten the past. But they killed your young. The Thelvari pressed. How can you show them mercy? Sarah looked out at the gathered delegates, many of whom had sat in silence while human children died. Mercy is not the same as forgiveness, she said. We will never forget what they did, and we will never stop making sure they cannot do it again. But we will also never become the monsters we fought. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of humanity's promise. Our children did not die so that we could become destroyers. They died because they were innocent. And we honor their memory by protecting innocence wherever we find it, even among those who once threatened it. The chamber fell silent. And for the first time since the crisis began, some of the alien delegates began to understand what made humanity different, not their weapons or their technology or their numbers, but their ability to hold fury and compassion in the same heart, to fight with everything they had and then extend a hand to help their enemies stand again. The Valkyrie dominion was gone, replaced by something new, something that might one day become better than what came before, and in the ashes of war, the first seeds of a different kind of future were being planted. 50 years had passed since the long night of the Valkyrie, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to those who lived through that terrible time. The New Eden Doctrine, as it came to be known, was now the foundational law of interstellar civilization, a simple principle that every species had agreed to uphold. Harm to any species' children would be met with unified, overwhelming response. But humanity had not built this new order through fear alone on 100 worlds. UN-funded schools taught children of every species side by side, helping them learn not just academics, but understanding, empathy, and the value of life in all its forms. Hospitals bearing human names treated the sick and injured, regardless of their origin. And orphanages gave homes to the young who had none. Each facility a monument to what the galaxy had learned from humanity's example. Interspecies child protection corps patrolled the spaceways. A fleet crewed by volunteers from dozens of species who had pledged to defend the innocent. And among their ranks were many former Valkyrie who had grown up in the new schools and chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting what their ancestors had once threatened on. The former Valkyrie homeworld, now called New Beginning by its inhabitants. A young historian named Kethrix was preparing for the most important interview of her career. Kethrix was unusual among her people. She had been born after the war, raised in human schools, and she had never known the Old Dominion, except through historical records and the shameful memories of her elders. She had dedicated her life to documenting the transformation of her species. And today she would speak with someone who had lived through it all. May Santis was 64 years old now. Her dark hair streaked with gray and her face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. And she sat in the garden of her home on New Eden, surrounded by flowers that had been planted by her grandchildren. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Kethrix said, her translator rendering her clicks into smooth human speech. "I know this must bring up difficult memories," May smiled. And there was warmth in it despite everything. "Some memories are difficult," she agreed. "But they are also important, and if sharing them helps your people understand what happened and why, then the difficulty is worth it." Kethrix activated her recording device and leaned forward. "You were 9 years old when the Valkyrie took you from New Eden, and you spent 6 months in captivity before the rescue. How did you survive?" May was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant as she remembered. "I survived because I was not alone," she said finally. "There were other children with me, younger ones who were even more scared than I was. And taking care of them gave me something to focus on besides my own fear." She looked at Kethrix with an expression that was hard to read. "I also survived because I never stopped believing that my people would come for us. That they would never give up, never stop looking, never leave us behind. And they did come," Kethrix said softly. "Yes, they did. Every single one of them." The historian hesitated before asking her next question, knowing it might be painful. "Do you hate us?" "The Valkyrie. Do you hate what my ancestors did to you?" May considered the question for a long moment, her gaze drifting to a corner of the garden where a memorial stone stood bearing 47 names. "I hated them once," she admitted, "when I was young and the memories were fresh. When I would wake up screaming from nightmares about cold cells and clicking voices. Yes, I hated them very much. And now? Now I understand that hate is a fire, and fires burn out eventually, leaving nothing but ash," May said. "What remains is the promise we made that no child, anywhere, would be forgotten." She reached out and touched Kethrix's hand, a gesture of connection that made the young Valkyrie's eyes widen in surprise. "I look at you, and I do not see my captors," May continued. "I see a young person who is trying to understand the past so that she can help build a better future. And that is exactly what we hoped would happen when we chose to rebuild rather than destroy." Kethrix felt something warm spreading through her chest, an emotion she had heard humans call hope. "But how did your people find the strength to show mercy after everything that happened?" she asked. "How did they stop themselves from doing to us what we had done to others?" May smiled again, and this time there were tears in her eyes. "Because we remembered what we were fighting for," she said. "We were fighting to protect children, to create a galaxy where the young could grow up safe and loved. And you cannot build that kind of future by teaching children that destruction is the answer to every wrong." She gestured around her garden, at the flowers and the trees and the distant sound of children playing. "The children who died on New Eden did not die so that we could become monsters. They died because they were innocent. And the only way to truly honor them was to protect innocence wherever we found it, even among those who had once threatened it. Kethrix was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. May I ask one more question? Of course. Do you think the galaxy is better now than it was before? Despite everything that happened? Despite all the pain and loss? May looked up at the sky, where the HSS Lullaby 2 could be seen in orbit, keeping eternal watch over New Eden just as its predecessor had done. I think the galaxy has a chance to be better, she said carefully, a chance it did not have before. Because now there is a law that protects the innocent and a species willing to enforce it. She turned back to Kethrix with something fierce in her aged eyes. But that chance must be nurtured and protected, generation after generation, by people like you who are willing to learn from the past and work for a better future. People like me? Kethrix repeated, surprised. Yes, people like you, because the true measure of change is not what the conquerors do, but what the children of the conquered become. The interview continued for several more hours, and when it was finally finished, Kethrix thanked May and prepared to leave, but at the garden gate, she turned back one more time. Mrs. Santos, may I ask what happened to the other children who were with you in that facility? The ones you took care of? May's face lit up with genuine joy. They are my family, she said simply. We may not share blood, but we share something stronger. We share survival. And every year we gather to remember those who did not make it and to celebrate those who did. Even the non-human children? The ones from other species? Especially them, May said, because they taught us that family is not about species or origin, but about the bonds we choose to form and the people we choose to protect. Kethrix felt her eyes growing wet, a response she had learned from human classmates, but had never quite understood until this moment. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for showing me what humanity really is. May walked to the gate and embraced the young Valkyrie, holding her close for a moment before letting go. Go and tell our story, she said. Tell it to your people and to the galaxy, so that no one ever forgets why we made the choices we made. I will. I promise. As Kethrix's S-shuttle lifted off and climbed toward orbit, May watched it go with a peace she had not felt in many years. She thought of the children she had protected in that cold cell. Now grown with children and grandchildren of their own, she thought of the 7 who had not survived, whose names were carved on memorial stones across the galaxy, and she thought of the little boy she had been unable to save on the day New Eden burned, whose last words had been asking for his mother. We kept our promise, she whispered to the sky, to the stars, to the memory of everyone who had been lost. We made sure no one was forgotten. On the rebuilt New Eden, the memorial that had been constructed where the school once stood gleamed in the afternoon. Senate was made of white stone quarried from a dozen worlds, a gift from species across the galaxy who wanted to honor what had been lost and what had been. Gain 47 names were carved into its surface in letters of gold, and beneath them was an inscription in every known galactic language. They were children. They were ours. They are remembered. And in orbit above, the HSS Lullaby 2 kept its eternal watch, a reminder to the galaxy that humanity's love was boundless, and so was its fury.